There we
This
go.
year is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and because D-Day was 1944, but the Germans surrendered, I think, the first week of May in 1945, and our friend Vlad Putin wrote an article about World War II from the Russian perspective, which was um, kind of a reaction to the European Parliament coming out with a statement last year um, blaming Russia for starting World War II. Basically, the World War II started with this Hitler, Stalin, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact in 1939, where the Russians and the Germans agreed to divide Poland. So Putin wrote kind of in response to that, wrote this long article in the National Interest magazine. I'm not even sure it's probably an RT front or something. I don't know what it is, but basically saying, talking about the sacrifices that the Russian nation made, and that his own experiences, and then talking about why they entered into this agreement with Nazi Germany, and talking about some other things in there. And I thought it's interesting because I did read through it pretty carefully, and I think both sides are right and both sides are wrong in terms of like what we learn here in the West and what Putin put into his explanation for the Russian understanding of World War II. So number one, the West did not defeat the Germans starting on D-Day, because basically in 1944 the war was pretty much, I wouldn't say winding down, but it was clear that Germany was going to be, and as well as Japan, were going to be defeated. And it certainly hastened the end of the war, and it was an important factor in the end of the war. But Putin makes the point that out of the Americans who participated in the war, I'm not sure if it's all Americans. It was like the number of Americans who lost their lives was like 1 out of 387 or something like that. Whereas in Russia, it was like 1 out of 7. So they took the brunt uh, of the Nazi onslaught, which was in 1941 when Hitler invaded Russia. So or I should say the Soviet Union. So basically, um, uh, Belarus, Ukraine, uh, as well as Russia, as well as other parts of the Soviet Union, were invaded by the Nazis, and they lost tens of millions of people. And basically, they turned the war around in Stalingrad, and were able to come back and push the Nazis back into Germany, and arrive in Berlin in May of 1945. So, but Putin also talks about the Baltic republics, okay? Because as a result of the Hitler-Stalin pact in 1939, there were some secret protocols, and as a result of that, um, it was agreed that Poland would be divided between the Nazis and the Russians, and that the Soviets would have a sphere of influence in the Baltic states, essentially giving them a green light to militarily take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And what happened in reality was that they were basically threatened by the Soviet states, saying, if you don't become part of the Soviet Union, we're going to invade you and forcibly make you part of the Soviet Union. And so this is what Putin wrote. He said, in autumn 1939, the Soviet Union, uh, pursuing its military and defensive goals, started the process of incorporation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Their accession to the USSR was implemented on a contractual basis with the consent of the elected authorities. This was in line with international and state law of that time. So, but he's basically saying is that they reached some kind of agreement, a contract, and that, basically they were, at the other end of the barrel of a gun, and they agreed, rather than try to fight it, they agreed to become part of the Soviet Union. And this was in line with international state law of that time, implying that nowadays that wouldn't work. So yeah, I think Putin justifiably deserves criticism for kind of rewriting history. But in a larger sense, I think there has to be a more balanced view of the role of Russia in World War II and the defeat of the Nazis, and that yes, they were pursuing their own interest, but if they did not reach an agreement with the Nazis in 1939, probably the Nazis would be that much closer to Moscow. And they got within 8 to 12 miles of Moscow. People don't know this, but they were very close to taking over Moscow in 1941. And if they hadn't had that extra buffer, there's a good chance that regime would have collapsed. So it was in that sense, Putin is right. It was a matter of survival for them. And I just think it's interesting how it's all black and white in the press, like Putin is bad, we're good, whatever. I think, it's a lot more subtle than just, one side is right, one side's wrong.
Well, when I heard about that article, what they were talking about was that I guess the purpose of him writing it was almost like a warning to the West about committing historical revisionism.
Yeah, because according to the West, according to the statement by the European Parliament, World War II started with the Hitler-Stalin pact on August 23rd, 1939. And I think that's just not true. And I think, and even people in the West have said that's just not true, because the roots for World War II were sown in were laid in World War I. So basically, it had been in the making for a long, long time. And you have to look at all these things. I mean, Poland was carved up by Germany and Russia, but the reality is that Poland was not a country, a sovereign country between like 1796 and 1919. I mean, it was divided between the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was no country of Poland, so that was the Russian sphere of influence under the Tsarist period, that part of Poland. So Warsaw was part of the Russian Empire. So I mean, you have to look at the historical context. Not that justifies their invading Poland, and also the atrocities that both sides committed in Poland. I mean, there's a famous massacre that took place in 1940, I believe, in Katyn Forest, where all the elite of the Polish officers were rounded up and summarily executed on orders of Lavrenti Beria, who was the interior minister under Stalin, head of the secret police. And this was like tens of thousands of officers were murdered, and the Nazis, made a big deal about this, and the Soviets said, well, the Nazis did this, and they finally in 1990 the Soviets admitted that yes, we did that. But there were also massacres, in the same location by the Nazis a few years later. So it's like both sides are not without sin.
Yeah, and it's funny because it almost reminds me of the Thanksgiving revisionism, historical revisionism that has happened. Where like we don't want to talk about how American companies were actually making money off of helping the Germans, helping the Nazis, with a lot of their, like building a lot of these concentration camps, and then the pieces of the artillery that they were using. Like a lot of these things, American companies were actually pivotal to their success.
Right.
And the fact that Russia they lost so many, right? But in looking back at it now, people only remember how America came and saved the day and that's it, and won the war for everybody.
Right.
And it's like I said, it almost reminds me of what's happened with Thanksgiving, how really what happened was a massacre of people right?
Right.
And how these people were essentially enslaved by by the pilgrims that came here. They didn't have this wonderful dinner. They sat down and shared all their things. You know, that's not what happened. But that's you know, that's not the story that's told to everybody. You know, and you know.
Well, it's just like, the founding fathers, the the cognitive dissonance of thinking of the founding fathers as slave owners, because that wasn't even really talked about, more than maybe 20 or 30 years ago. It first came up as a real, concept. So now it's now that, they're going after these statues or whatever. But I think, yeah, you have this popular narrative of what history is, and then you have the reality. So like this statement that was the European Parliament issued last year condemning the Soviet Union, basically blaming the Soviet Union for starting World War II and lumping together Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Stalinist Soviet Union as totalitarian states. I think that's revisionist history as well, because you know they're they were both totalitarian, yes, but there is no equivalence between Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. I mean, Hitler Germany was a genocidal um, project that was, I mean, is not, there's no parallel to there's certain, yes, there's certain similarities in terms of totalitarian structure, but in terms of what their mission was, yes, they're both bent on world conquest, so to speak, but I don't think there's an equivalence between the two, and to say that, I think really grossly oversimplifies history.